to introduce ourselves. And good afternoon. My name is Daniel Chakal, and I'm the Director of Web Marketing here at Project Assistance. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar presenting a model for PMO maturity to improve portfolio and project outcomes. Our presenter is Gus Chakala. He's the President, CEO of Project Assistance, and our resident project management expert. He founded Project Assistance in 1996, starting with the mission to achieve better, faster, more cost-effective project results, and has only gotten more ambitious from there. Now our goal is to make project failure obsolete. He's a recognized portfolio and project management expert. He's published many popular articles, books on the subject, chapters, contributing author, our own training guide, a keynote speaker on the subject, frequently sought after to speak on the subject of project management. So take it away, Gus.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks everybody for being here today. And what we're covering today is a topic that has been shaped over decades, literally. We've been doing this for a long time. The most recent public presentation was a request at PMI in New York City, a PMO roundtable that they want us to present this. So we're adapting basically a 2-hour presentation into about 45 minutes. So this is going to move pretty fast. So the presentation agenda today is we're going to talk about the introduction, what we mean by maturity, which is not my favorite word, so we're going to get into that and maybe define it a little better. The methodology for PMO maturity. So how does a project management based organization like a PMO get better? And we'll talk about some samples of some of the outputs that come from this methodology. We call it the VIA methodology, and within the VIA methodology, we'll talk about the analysis, vision, and roadmap, which is really the essence of today. And we'll have a little session at the end, if you want, about Q&A and some giveaways, which we can't do on recorded webinars, but we can do it when it's live. So to get started, PMO maturity challenges, like, how does a PMO get better? And what kind of problems are we trying to get past to make a PMO more effective, such that the outcomes of projects are more effective? So defining a proven model and approach for maturity is a demand out there. Is there a standard? We'll talk about that. Surviving the valley of despair. We had a webinar a long time ago. The topic was burning the ships, right? It was a saying from Cortez with the conquistadors of South America that we're going to burn the ships because we're not going back, right? But we certainly do see situations where a PMO does go back, right? We go to a new place, a new productivity, and the changes aren't working. So the valley of despair, or sometimes I even call it the vortex, because it's not just one valley, it's a series of valleys. So that's a problem, right? Dealing with an embedded culture and really trying to move forward and get to a more productive environment is tricky. Lonely PMO directors, right? So a lot of organizations have resistance of expanding the headcount in a PMO. So we've seen a lot of solo PMO directors, and they're expected to do everything, and that's not easy. So not enough time, not enough skills, not a methodology to do it right. Unrealistic expectations. So we've seen PMO directors that have a target on their back. Hey, we hired you in September, and now it's December, and why are we not seeing earned value reporting? Well, that takes 18 months. That takes 3 years. It takes 5 years, depending on the organization. So that's a challenge. Unable to garner full engagement from the business sponsor. So, a lot of times is the solution architects, the business architects, the product developers, the designers that are making these sort of products that come out of projects. sometimes don't have enough information to be clear about what they're really supposed to be solving. So that can be a problem. And the lack of proven methodology to change the organization. So there's really two methodologies about today in terms of executing a project, but there's one lurking in off stage, which is how do you change the organization? You know, and we'll talk about that. So some terminology today. We're going to talk about some terminology that we use in our methodology, like the PPM disciplines, right? So if you think about portfolio and project management, it's a series of connected sciences or disciplines, as we call them, because they're not always sciences. It includes the PMBOK knowledge areas, and there's others we've added to that at the portfolio level, the organization level. PMO maturity. So we have a slide on that, but when people talk about, well, what's your maturity? We look at that in three different, we call them vectors, right? Rigor, adoption, and complexity, to provide objective measures, right? So what's the current state, what's the future state, and how did you derive this so-called maturity, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit, and the dimensions. So we have disciplines, vectors, and dimensions, right? And the dimensions are the most popular ones we hear: process, people, technology, and we add to that the governance also for the fourth foundational dimension. So that's just some terminology you'll be hearing as we talk for the next 40 minutes. So achieving the mission through execution, why does PPM matter? I had an executive probably 15 years ago. I said, we can take you from a level 2 to a level 4 of maturity. And what he said was, well, why do I care? Why does maturity care? Or, why does maturity be relevant? So the idea is, the backdrop of this is, why do we do PPM? Well, the idea is, when we get through the mission and the values and the vision of an organization, the question is, how do you transfer a strategy into a series of initiatives, and how do you make sure that those initiatives are successful? Right. So, and at the execution layer, obviously, we're looking at the solution delivery lifecycle, as well as the project and program management. One delivers to the specification or the scope or the satisfaction of the quality. I use them interchangeably. And the project and program management is the business of running the project. So that's just the foundation. And we'll talk about how these disciplines interact with these two methodologies. So, one part is the right projects, and the other one is done right. Okay. So what is PMO maturity? So we talk about the PMO maturity scores derived from the three vectors that define the maturity of each of the 14 PPM disciplines, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about, to be mature, you have to decide where you're going to land, right? What is the future state we're trying to get to? And when we think about this rigor, complexity, and adoption, I'll give you a couple of examples. Rigor, we would say around, let's say, for example, resource management is one of the disciplines. What's the rigor? Well, are we having quantitative estimates of the demand of resources? That would be a level of rigor, right? The complexity is really a question of how hard is it, that discipline, to change an organization. And then the adoption, we have seen a lot of organizations that have achieved a level of rigorous, I would say, documentation of methodology, but not have a high level of adoption of that methodology, right? So, and from our view, that's upside down. Would you rather have a real rigorous process that nobody uses, or have an adopted process and methodology that is highly adopted, and start with low rigor and move that rigor along the maturity spectrum? Okay, so that's sort of, again, some terminology about how we talk about this topic. So how do the PPM dimensions drive maturity? And, you know, one of the things that really triggered this methodology, you know, Project Assistance was founded 23 years ago, almost 24 now, 1996. And, you know, when we were, our first product was around Microsoft Project. It was an add-on called Project Commander, and it didn't take very much time to figure out that it wasn't about the technology, right? The tools and technologies are enablers of rigor. You know, when we had enterprise PPM, you know, Clarity, Microsoft Project, Primavera, PlanView, those kinds of things, and now a lot, you know, out in the cloud. It was pretty obvious that when you saw those demonstrations of that technology, that it could deliver a pretty rigorous process. And what a lot of folks and a lot of organizations didn't really understand, or maybe understand but don't know how to approach it, is how do you make these four gears, these dimensions, mesh? Because what we learned was, if you put technology in, and I would say at least 90% the times that we've implemented a technology, a portfolio project management technology, that there was an expectation that technology would increase rigor. It's an enabler. We're going to take a higher level of maturity because this technology is going to take us there. And one of the failings around that is understanding that if you change technology and you increase rigor, that means your processes are going to be more rigorous. It means your skills are going to be more rigorous, which means your project managers may not have the skills. And the governance says, well, we have to move the culture somehow, right? So what we've seen is, and the purpose of thinking about what is the maturity, what is the rigor and the complexity and the adoption of these disciplines, how do you make them fly in formation in terms from the perspective of how we technically use a discipline, how we have a process or a standard or a best practice around that discipline for our organization, for what we're ready to do, and then to look into the organization, is it structured, and does it have the skills and the roles and the bandwidth? I mean, we've seen situations where you have highly skilled project managers and a high level of rigor is coming in, and the technology can handle it. And one of the breakdowns is that the skills are there, but the bandwidth is not. If we increase rigor, that's going to create more time for the project manager. So if we think we're going to bring in rigor and keep the same project managers in the same capacity that we have today, is false, right? It's not going to work. So that's sort of the foundation of what we're talking about today, is how do you bring these things together? And you know, it's a broad topic, because when you think about changing all these things, we'll talk about that. We call it a sort of mini portfolio. So what are the disciplines? A lot of these you would recognize if you know the PMBOK. There's others. I'm not going to read them out to you. You would probably recognize things like cost management, scope management, communications management, you know, are all around the PMBOK knowledge areas. There's some things at the enterprise level, the portfolio level. And I could even tell you, if we just double-clicked on 11, you could find disciplines, obviously, with portfolio management itself. Okay, so you could even break it down more. So this is a model, and it's a flexible model. So a sample summary. So this is, what we're showing here is a tool that we use, a proprietary tool, and this is not meant to be read, those little characters you see. But what we're looking at here is a discipline called, I'll pick on PMO governance. And it has a level 1, and under level 1, it has a level of rigor and a level of adoption, and also has a complexity score. Okay, the complexity score has a bearing on an overall score for maturity. So this is a model, and the idea around this model is to prescribe what does a level of rigor for PMO governance sound like on level 1? What's the next progression to level 2 of rigor? What's the progression 3? What's the progression 4 and 5? So this is used to do two things. To do an assessment and an analysis of an organization that says, hey, you've got 14 disciplines and you can't do them all overnight. And by the way, if you're going to get deep into a discipline, that means the skills, it means the processes, it means the tools and technology, and it means a way to change the culture or the organizational change. Okay, so this tool is intended to say, how do you look at 14 disciplines across rigor, complexity, and adoption, and get an idea of what the current state is, what the future state is, and how wide is the gap? So what is it? It's a traditional gap analysis, this tool, but it's customized and proprietary to the science of portfolio and project management, and specific to the question to a PMO, how do we get better in an orderly fashion? How do we put a plan around this? Okay, so this is just blowing up a couple examples around here. What you might see, no formal PMO or governance procedures exist. The next one says the PMO exists without governance procedures. So there's some examples there. You see some zeros in here. This is just from a tool that's not for an actual assessment. Here's level 3, level 4. So what's happening is when you think about the summary of the current state, what we're doing is putting a current state score 1 to 5, a future state score 1 to 5, and a gap. If you're at a 2 now and you're going to a 4, there's going to be a delta of 2. Okay, so in this case, the number 2 is the summary of a rigor level of 1, an adoption of 1, and therefore your current score of maturity is a 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a weighted score by multiplying the degree of complexity. Why do we do this? Well, you can start looking at a current state and a future state, and in most cases, when we use this tool, organizations have a mandate to move quickly, and therefore the gap is wide. If you get honest about the rigor, adoption, and complexity of the 14 disciplines, the question is how far? Well, what's a feasible leap, right? Well, what a feasible leap is, how wide is the gap, and can we close the gap? And the answer is we can't go from 1 to 5 and 14 disciplines in one step, right? So the question is, how do you sequence the movement of maturity by having a reasonable sequence of increases of rigor, increases of adoption, and understanding the complexities? Because here's the real deal, and anybody who's done this in a PMO or even a project manager, the holy grail between, or we call it the keystone, a past webinar, is, you know, what holds together the credibility and the feasibility of a portfolio is a project plan that has the capacity to deliver the demand. What does that mean? It means we can balance our resources, right? So if you think about the complexity in an organization that says, we're going to take a tool, we're going to take a set of processes, we're going to take a bunch of project managers with skills, and we're going to change the organization, that everybody's going to have an estimate of the demand of all the resources in the project. We're going to have a good idea of what the capacity is, and we're going to be able to summarize that and send that up to the management chain, say, if we're going to fulfill the demand of this portfolio over, let's say, for the 2020 budget cycle, do we have the capacity? Well, that's one of the highest rigorous, highest complexity things that we can do, right? And they tend to be on lower in the maturity, and they require of other parts of the discipline to get better before we can go there. So what happens? We'll talk about that. So here's an example where we're trying to get to a rigor of 3 and adoption of 4. So what's the gap? It's a 5. What's the degree of the complexity, it's a 3. So now we have a gap. So at the end of the 14 disciplines, we're looking for a score that is reasonable. Something that's not a low score is not worth the effort, and one that's over probably above 70 or 80 is going to be probably not feasible. Okay, so that's an example of what a grid might look like when you start adding these things up. Okay, so again, these are, I'm just sort of zooming into level 1 with some scores. These are just, again, definitions of, in this case, we're looking at risk management, resource capacity, meaning at the project level. That has to happen first before you can do enterprise, and then schedule performance management, right? And usually you can't do resource capacity management unless you're pretty good at schedule performance management first. What do I mean by that? We can look at a baseline of the schedule and an actual update of the performance of that schedule and have variances and understand if we're hitting the schedule, right? The problem is chicken and the egg. How can your schedule be credible if it doesn't have capacity and demand, and knowing that we have the feasibility of those resources showing up? Okay, level 3 has some, so I'm going to go back and just read a couple of these. So risk management. Level 1 says risks are not identified, no contingency planning. Level 2 says risks are informally documented in text, not metrics. And risk identification is not regularly reviewed. When risks are realized, contingency plans are often not followed. Level 3, risks are formally identified, contingency plans are formally documented, metrics are captured for severity and odds of occurrence. Level 4, risk identification, contingency planning, and use of metrics to measure probability and impact across all projects. The last one says historical quantitative. So that's a whole other topic. Risk scores are utilized to develop better contingency plans. And so you might say, well, I disagree with that. In our organization, we think number 4 would actually have identification and quantification. Well, we can change it, right? I mean, this is a tool we've used for a long time. It serves us well, but it also has flexibility. Okay, so what's the end game? Well, this is just a conceptual look at this, right? If we're looking at 4 disciplines around resource management, performance management, knowledge management, and issue management, and we're looking at the vectors around rigor and adoption, the idea is to understand what is our current state and where are we taking it, right? So if we drew a picture of that, it would look like that. Now, the reality is, if I double click on resource management, it's not one thing. There's not one initiative to transform a PMO to just say, we're just going to do resource management. We start double clicking on that, and now we start seeing impacts to the technology side, to the skills side, to the process side. And not only that, if you start looking at the maturity of resource management, one simple word, estimate, could take down the whole house of cards, right? In Microsoft Project, the field's called work, right? If you put a task out there and you assign a resource and it says work, and I put eight hours out there, that is assumed to be an accurate estimate of the demand of that resource. Well, where did the 8 hours come from, right? So even if we have the capability and the bandwidth of a project manager to put a demand number and an estimate on an assignment in a project, and I could summarize that and say, now I know that the development team is going to have these hours over this time period, and it looks like it fits. The question is, what's the credibility of the estimate, right? So you know, a lot of organizations, to get the bandwidth to run a real estimating methodology is not going to happen overnight. Okay, so this is very conceptual. It doesn't, in the real world, we would have maybe 4 dots under resource management and maybe have priorities on it and show it on a time scale also that says this is going to happen over 6 quarters to get that number. So this is conceptual. So crawl before you walk, right? You know, to do anything, you need the time, the people, the proficiency, the expertise, the governance, and the project managers to make it happen, right? So part of this is really understanding. I call it the project, right? You know, we go to a PMO and we say, you know, what's your plan? There's usually not, and this is not an indictment, but as good as a PMO director is and the experience they have of putting plans together and understanding how to scope something and to put an approach in there and to estimate and to put costs and put timings and the things that we would say, God forbid, a project charter. There's a lot of overworked project management directors, PMO directors, that haven't had the time to really think deep into this, to present a case, a business case, to show the portfolio of initiatives that would have to occur to make this kind of movement, right? So that's the crawl before you walk, right? Why do we build project plans and bring them to sponsors, to stakeholders, to give them the reality of the time and the cost and the energy and the things that have to change such that we get buy-in, right? And this stuff doesn't happen overnight, so we need to buy some time. So you know, what I've been talking about is a framework that we work here at Project Assistance, and you know, like we've been doing this for a long time around project management consulting, let's say. So if you look at the middle part of this, if you go to our website on the solutions that we provide, you know, you're going to find process improvement. You're going to find configuration of technology tools. You're going to see my book on Microsoft Project and the training we do on that with the education. You know, how to implement and stand up PPM technologies. So when we get a call on column 2, we start talking about column 1, right? In other words, the reason those 4 gears are there, it's like, hey, if you're going to implement training, or if you're going to implement a methodology, if you're going to implement technology, they don't stand alone on an island. So what we've tried to do is to either to understand, and it happens, that a PMO does have a vision, that they have a good idea of the current state, they have a good idea of what the future state needs to look like. They've done some gap analysis. The visioning is done, and there's a roadmap. But what we find out in most cases that sort of process hasn't been run, right? So let's just double click on that. So the value of a vision phase. So let's just say a PPM solution is going to go out here, and depending on the size of an organization, it could be less or more. It could be a lot more in a big organization, certainly millions of dollars. But when you think about the typical investment of a PPM solution, there's an investment up front, right? And so what we've seen is organizations that focus, and in a lot of cases, focus on installing a piece of technology that's going to take you to the promised land because it has the enabling capability to increase rigor and complexity and move the organization along, right? But what we've seen is over hundreds of PPM technologies installs that if there's not really a vision step or a roadmap around the 4 dimensions, the failure rate has been, our experience, I'm not proud of this, about 85%. Now failure is a debatable question, and we could do a whole webinar on that, especially project failure. But we're talking about when we say about what's the definition of a failure of a PPM solution, I would say the failure to deliver the benefits, right? And I would say more importantly, the most important benefits, right? So we've seen PPM technologies go out there, and at the end they might have a dashboard and they have some projects out there and people using it. But the question was, what was the main benefit? Well, we wanted to go to the Holy Grail. We wanted resource management. We wanted to have a balanced scorecard. We wanted to have capacity versus demand across our skill centers to understand that we can deliver the portfolio. Well, we didn't get that, right? So we call that failure, right? So, the technology might be working, and you might be sending annual subscriptions to your favorite SaaS PPM technology, or Microsoft, or Clarity, or whoever it is, but not really getting the benefit, and that's what it's all about. Our idea of success is on time, on budget, on spec, but the fourth dimension is the measurable benefits of the investment. Okay. So this vision stage, we call it an AVR, analysis vision roadmap, is going through the exercise that we just showed you, right? By using that tool to say, how do we break down an analysis of an organization? And here's the other challenge, right? We think about current state, especially in a more complex or a larger organization, and you start thinking about technology. Well, there's not one technology. I mean, we've gone into organizations that have 3 separate PPM tools, or they have 2 groups on the same tool, but they're on separate instances, and the data doesn't come together. So there is a level of complexity to really understand what is the current state. And here's the other thing: how do you just put one number or one discipline on a complex organization? So there's another whole conversation about that. But the point is, if we're doing a vision and we're trying to analyze the current state, it does take some time. A lot of organizations admit that they're probably 0 or 1 or self-deprecating sort of scores, but it's important to really understand where we do stand in those 4 dimensions around people, process, technology, and governance, and understand how those gears have to mesh in harmony, right? So how does that work? Well, we sort of showed that model where when we do the preparation, and it's kind of talk about indictments. We have a checklist of have you done these things in the past? Do you have training on Microsoft projects? What technologies do you use? What are the status reports? What are the it's 2 pages of a laundry list that if you had those things, you wouldn't have called us anyway, right? But the preparation is to really understand how we're going to interview, how we're going to observe the current state. If you talk to people, we do that 80% of the time. Well, when you start expecting and inspecting what's out there, a lot of times the self-image is out of sync of reality, right? So it's really important to get reality, and reality tends to be a little bit over the map, right? So you got to get a meaningful sample, and and I'm talking about what we do. I mean, today is talking about what a PMO can do, and this is a framework to think about it, right? So review the project and process documentation. That's inspection, right? Not only just how do you feel you're doing, we need some evidence, right? So what does that mean? Well, you come up with what's the current state. The future state's trickier, right? The current state is somewhat static in a snap of time, but from the future state, the reason this thing started with us when Project Server came out in 2003, 2002, actually, we just go up on a whiteboard with requirements, and what we got was level 5 maturity, 5 high levels of rigor, high levels of adoption, expectations, a lot of complexity, and it was like, okay, wait a minute, we can configure a PPM tool to do these things, and you saw the demo, and you saw balance scores cards, and you saw balance between demand, resource, and the capacity of the available resources to assign to that portfolio, and we don't have enough information to really understand where we're going to go with this, right? So if you don't have the information for the future, or if you want to go there fast, the question is, do we understand what the sequencing is? How do you move the processes how do you move the people skills? How do you move the organizational culture? How do you move the technology? Because the technology is easily ahead of everything else, right? So there's always a danger there. The visioning step is a workshop. We recommend a workshop to debate aggressive expectations to move to a high level of rigor and adoption at a pace that's not realistic, right? So at the end of the day, what happens, when you start laying out the levels of rigor and adoption, what starts to become obvious is we've got to change a lot of different things around process and around the skills. And I mean, sometimes it's changing job role definitions, right? Sometimes it's adding new people. Sometimes it's changing the structure of the organization. So when we think about, so if you get visioning done and how does the future state look? How do you get there? The roadmap is, I said this probably twice at least, a mini portfolio. Well, what does that mean? Well, I said initiatives, but the reason I call it a project is it's a series of projects, initiatives, charters that have time and scope and schedules and resources and costs to say, here's what we need to do to achieve this future state. And oh, by the way, this thing has sequencing. This is not one step. This is, we buy a piece of technology, we change all the processes, we put all the skills out there, we go to training, we put a magic wand, and voila, we go from 1 to 4, or whatever you're trying to get, right? So that's kind of the sort of the overall framework of what we mean by analysis, vision, and roadmap. Timing. This is aggressive. Could it happen this fast? Yeah. Why is this out here? The question is how does this get done? Organizations don't stop executing a portfolio when they have recognize that something's not right, that we're not getting the benefit of the investments, that we're failing, our projects are not delivering the benefits. We got to change something. Well, nobody says, okay, well, we'll just give you a year off in 2020 to not do any projects, and when you change everything over, let us know and we'll start projects again, right? So it's I remember before Clarity, it was called Project Workbench, and I wish I'd saved the advertisement they had. It was 2 guys sitting on a plane on the wing, and they were painting the side of the fuselage of the aircraft, and inside the windows were the passengers looking out the window, and the painters were trying to paint, and their hair was blowing around, and the paint was getting splashed all over the place because they were on a jet going 500 miles an hour, and the subtitle said, or the caption said, with 200 flights a day, we have to do this while we're still flying, right? And I thought it was interesting in a project management sort of motif to have this idea that we can't land the plane, but we still have to paint it. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we run into. You just can't stop the train. You got to jump on the train and hope you don't get splat before you get on the train. So these plans, the reason I say that on the side is, can you really bring people together in 3 to 4 weeks to even make up their minds about what the future should look like when they're already spread pretty thin? In our preparation, we talk about titles. We talk about, the kinds of people that have to be involved. When you think about it, one more effort to create a scope with stakeholders and make sure that everybody's on the same page. Again, based on the size of the organization and the impact of an initiative like this, that could be a 3-month process. We did one that went for a year. It's $1 million. Right? That's not the average, but it happens. So what are the deliverables, for a PMO? Well, I mean, it's, the beginning is a self-awareness of the reality of where we are. And again, why do we talk about the 4 disciplines? Because they matter, right? Do we have a handle in the current state about our people and process and technology and our ability to change culture? Having those 4 dimensions, having the 14 disciplines, having the 3 vectors that measure maturity is, you put that into a grid. I mean, you start getting a picture of the complexity of what you're trying to move to the future. So it's a finding. Those grids I showed earlier are part of the findings, right? It's not uncommon, it's most common that even before the visioning, there are recommendations. By the way, I said this before, but I'll emphasize it here. Excuse me. We oftentimes get a call, and if you're in a PMO, you get the call says, we're going to have to get a new tool, we're going to have to change the process, we're going to agile, whatever it happens to be. It means we're going to start moving something, and we have to be ready for that, right? So when this thing comes along, the question is, how do you start defining what the scope of this thing is, right? A reporting documentation that says a current state is each of the 14 disciplines, and the foundation that I was getting to is this initiative oftentimes starts because somebody says something specifically has to happen. We are going to change the technology. We are going to bring agile in. We are going to take a higher level of rigor with our project managers. And what that means is when you're coming down with assessment findings and you're looking for a future state, those things are going to be there, right? So what's the point? Well, it's not uncommon to get a call that says, the end game does have to be, we know where our resources are. We are going for the Holy Grail, right? So the vision workshop and presentation part of this is, sort of automatically pretty heavy, right? Pretty heavy in terms of really recognizing where you are and what it's going to take, right? So what does that mean? Out of the assessment findings, there's already recommendations, right? We're saying it's only just the current state, but the reality is we just talked to a lot of people. We talked before we even submitted a proposal, or if you're doing this yourself, you say, hey, wait a minute, we can't just put in a new piece of technology. We have to do a study first. That's what it sounds like, right? As a matter of fact, we try not to use the word assessment because it's overused, right? We call it analysis most times, because the assessment's nice, but the analysis is really the essence of understanding where we are, having a situational self-awareness of how far we are from the future and how serious and rigorous it's going to be to get there. And by the way, we call this AVR, we call that a methodology, right? I mean, you think about solution delivery like a NPD for new product development, or you think about IT software development or ITIL doing IT service management. All those things are separate methodologies. So all we're talking about today is an approach to say, well, oh, by the way, if you've got this project called "We Got to Get Better," this is this is kind of the approach that we are recommending, and so so with the PMO maturity roadmap, we talk about the initiatives, right? The high-level charters, the prioritization, the phasing, the business cases, the short-term implementation schedules, right? So if it makes your head hurt, you're getting it. Okay. Let me see. So the implementation stage is next, right? So we're really focusing on how to make a PMO mature and more effective such that it delivers the benefits of the investments in the portfolio, right? So so we talk about implementation and then adoption, and I'm just putting this out here as understanding that once we have the roadmap, execution is a big part of this, right? The adoption stage, the most ignored part and the most common pitfall of failure, right? So not having a formal approach to change management, organizational change management, using a real change management methodology is important, right? So I talk about in normal projects, you've got the solution delivery, and you've got the project management, and one gives the specification, quality, and scope. The other one gives you on time, on budget. Well, the other question is, you know, how do you really change the organization? And you know that applies whether you're changing a PMO or if you're changing an ERP, right? I mean, it's still organizational change management. So we layer this in here because anybody can write the process and anybody can install the technology and run the training for the skills, but you know, making them mesh in harmony, like the gears, and really, what's the saying, right? A well-oiled machine, right? So the reality of organizational change, I talked about this before, right? So you know, when organizations come to us, they're in survival mode. They know they're getting by, not as well as they could, and there's a future state where it's more productive and more value, and we want to go there. And at some point, you're going to go through the vortex of despair, right? And without an adoption or an organizational change methodology, the odds are very low for success. So what does that mean? Well, you know, it's kind of like the Maslow's pyramid, right? But now we're putting in survival mode at the level of how an organization gets better, right? The organizational hierarchy of survival has to go not only from mission and vision and values, but you know, how do we convert a strategy? I heard a great 3-word definition of a strategy, because a lot of people are confused about it, and I really like it. It was just a plan for change. Plan for change, 3 words, right? So we don't go to our vision until we change something. If it wouldn't be a vision if we were already there, right? So the question is, how do you get there? So sometimes we say, you know, projects change an organization, right? They deliver change. So what we're talking about today is how do you change the way you change, right? That's what the methodology is. The AVR methodology is a way to change the way the organization, how it changes through innovation. All right, so we talked about the outcomes, right? Failed implementations, implemented, not adopted, or implemented with limited capabilities. The most failures we see is number 3. Okay, we talked about the rates of maturity outcomes. If it's technology focused without a vision, it doesn't go well. Without adoption, they still fail at a high rate. So the last thing I'm going to show you pretty quickly is an approach to findings, right? So here's some tasks, right, to collect findings of the current state. Here's an example, a real example. Actually, it has a name in there, so I'm going to go past that pretty fast. Can we fix that, Dan? I saw a person's name there in that previous slide. Okay, that's my fault. Roadmap recommendations and initiatives. A summary of the roadmap initiatives, and here's recommendations that actually have a portfolio of initiatives. And if you read through this, you're going to see initiatives around methodology, initiatives around process, even create a methodology, language, and taxonomy of the skeleton of the processes, designing it, right? Understanding the separate methodologies that are going to be used. In this case, we're looking at 3 methodologies: portfolio, solution delivery, and project management. Portfolio considerations. Okay, so some changes there. Some changes around, in this case, processes come in a lot of different ways, right? So in this case, we're talking about processes, guidelines, RACEs, artifacts, sample deliverables, etc. Harvest and prioritize. I mean, we come on and we see stuff from the past, The question is, how do you leverage it, right? So if there's existing assets that haven't been adopted, a lot of times they can be adopted, right? So if it's a rigorous documented, the question is, you know, let's try another way with a better plan. Foster concurrence and ownership, right? So there's sort of an advertising and a change part about this. Sequencing it properly, developing plan for change management, communication plans, a multi-dimensional roadmap. Again, in this case, you're not seeing the gears, but you're seeing a light bulb, but still the same 4 dimensions. So let's see, a couple things. One of the questions we get, even if this is still part of the this webinar, is to anticipate a couple questions. One is, can you get to slides? The answer is yes. Okay, they'll be available. That's my email address. You can see our website. You can see my mug. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this up as a live webinar, so we can have it on demand. So we're going to transition from just me speaking and provide an opportunity for questions on the console. So thanks for staying for the webinar part of this, and if you want to stay on for another 5 minutes, top of the hour, we'll be available for that. Thank you.